just because that's what I wanted. And I don't want to sit in that. I want to be able to forgive all the damages that have been created by this person. And I would just like to ask for a blessing in finishing up early this week with that tenant and being free of that despair.
And so it is.
Thank you.
I would like to offer prayers for my grandchildren, for our grandchildren, who are once again undergoing disruption in their lives. Prayers for their mother's family. Prayers for our son Nick and his time with them. And prayers for us that we have the wisdom to help them through this.
And so it is.
Up all the way.
I'd like to offer a prayer of thanksgiving, Bob and I would, for just the pure pleasure of having all three of our kids here and just enjoying the heck out of a full house full of critters and people.
And so it is. Are there any other prayer requests? For all of those prayers not spoken, for all of those that are in tribulation, in crisis, in various forms of lack of peace. We see God's unconditional love expanding to embrace the entire planet and each and every individual on it. And we give thanks that this unconditional love is at work in their lives and ours. And for this, together we say, Amen. So, Doug, you have some music for us this morning. I'm going to mute everyone so that we don't have disruption. Doug, if you would unmute yourself. Well, I'll just unmute. Yeah, unmute yourself. There we go. Okay. Thank you. And I remind you, Speaker View gives you a full vision of Doug. Thank you, Doug. So, happy 4th of July. You know, the draft of the Declaration of Independence was adopted by the Continental Congress, and of course it was signed on the 4th of July in 1776. But we hear of the 13 colonies, and it turns out there were 15 colonies that were participating in that debate, and 2 of the colonies, Pennsylvania and South Carolina, chose not to sign it. New York chose to abstain, but they were counted as one of the 13 colonies. And all 15 colonies had representatives that were at the Continental Congress and that did sign, but the states themselves, or the colonies themselves, chose not to sign. So we have this idea that there were 13 colonies. Well, it turns out there were 15. And so we have the impression that there was unanimous support, and it turns out there wasn't, at least not among the colonies. It was another 11 years before the Constitution was enacted, and it was 4 years after that the Bill of Rights were adopted, and it's the first article of the Bill of Rights that gives us religious freedom. But the problem is that religious freedom doesn't guarantee our freedom for our spiritual journey. And whether we grew up in a religious household or grew up in one that was a-religious, I won't say atheist, but at least not actively engaged in religion, we nonetheless have, from a very early age, we have this conception of God being out there. Most of us do. I can't say all of us do, but most of us have this conception of God being out there, God judging us, God watching us, being in our minds and aware of all of our thoughts and all of our actions, all of our words. And all of those conceptions that were adopted at a very early age are embedded in us. I know myself, and I can only speak for myself in this respect, but some of those early ideas of God out there, God judging, still bubble up in my thought stream from time to time. And, I have to slap myself awake and say, no, wait a minute, that's not true. But nonetheless, our spiritual journeys are often affected by those early conceptions of God. And that can be a detriment. We're on a personal journey. I mean, in the end, our conception of truth, the truth of our being, is really up to us. I mean, no one can impose their truth on us. We can either accept or not what they have to say, their perceptions of truth, but it will not dictate to us how we believe. Now, we may draw guidance from other people's perceptions. Certainly, we're reading sacred texts, either of the tradition in which we reside, or other spiritual scripture, or other tradition scriptures. We may draw guidance from the writings of various authors and personal conversations. I mean, our neighbor next door, or our best friend from high school, or whomever that we regard with respect, can influence us in our perception of who we are and what our relationship with the divine really is. But in the end, it's up to us to form that our own truth. And unfortunately, those authorities that we were vested in early childhood still have an influence on our perceptions. So, a fundamental discipline of our lives is science. Without scientific methods, we would still be living in prehistoric conditions. We'd still be worshiping the thunder gods. We would still be eating whatever we happened upon or whatever we killed. Generally, living at the whim of nature. Excuse me. And a basic premise of science is that whatever happens in nature happens for a reason. Now, it's on that premise that scientific methodology, scientific thought is built. That if there is a loud noise in the sky, there's a reason for that. And science goes about the discovery, or practitioners of science go about the discovery of why that happened. And it turns out that our spiritual journey is very much like that. That we have a perception we have a perception of some foundational idea. And in unity, that foundational idea is found in our first principle, our first pillar of faith. Let me share with you that. You've seen it before, not surprising. There is one power and one presence, God, the good omnipotence. Okay, so that's a fundamental premise of Unity's teachings, and that fundamental premise of Unity's teachings is the foundation upon which all of Unity's teachings reside, or most of Unity's teachings reside. These 5 pillars of faith, by the way, were compiled in 1990, 100 years after Charles and Myrtle Fillmore started Modern Thought, and that being the magazine upon which later congregations gathered. And that congregation, it turns out, was a congregation in thought, congregation in presence. At 9 p.m. Central Time every night, there would be a congregation that would gather in their own homes in various parts of the country, but they would gather in prayer. Well, this fundamental premise of unity is it's important for us to acknowledge it and to come back to it. If we're going to follow Unity's teachings and understand Unity's teachings, we need to understand that there is one power and one presence, that there is no competition with God, that there is no devil, that there is nothing but it's all good. I mean, we hear that phrase, it's all good, in Unity, right? And we hear it elsewhere as well. I mean, New Age thinking is often permeated with it's all good. So that idea, one power and one presence, is fundamental to our teachings. There's also, and I have regarded this, I've referenced this often, is that there is also that any authority that you lay on someone outside of yourself is misplaced authority, that you are the one that is responsible for the obtaining of your absolute truth. And so whatever propositions that I may offer for your consideration, if they seem reasonable, for your testing of them in the laboratory of your experience. And that laboratory of your experience goes back to the idea of science. I mean, science is built upon this idea of coming up with propositions, coming up with ideas that are to be tested to see whether or not those ideas are provide an understanding of something that happens in nature. Okay, so that that idea then that there's one power and one presence in our lives and in the universe is fundamental. Now, that, as we look at our life experiences, as we regard the cause and effect in our life experiences, if we are understanding that there is one power and one presence, again, this is a testable premise, right? This is something that we will test out in our lives. But if there is this idea that there's one power and one presence, how does that provide us freedom? And I'm opening the floor here. I'd like to hear from you as to your thoughts as to how that idea, one power and one presence, God the good, omnipotence, is a basis for our spiritual freedom. And I'm going to have a drink. It's not vodka. One power, one presence.
Well, one thing that crossed my mind earlier when you were talking about sometimes feeling like you're being judged by that outside force of God, thought I had was just when one is feeling that way, that it is really judging yourself, because that God is within you. And you try to avoid judging yourself, but if you are judging yourself, maybe it is an indication you have stepped off the path you want to be on to some degree. And it's not an external God who's going to punish you for sin, but it's a signal to you to evaluate what you're doing and maybe make a shift.
Okay, so it's a road marker, you know. It's one of those tall poles that guide the snowplow drivers in their clearing of the high mountain roads. Okay, all right. What else? What about freedom from existential fear? You know, that idea that there is a God up there judging us. And so one power, one presence, God the good, omnipotence. That idea of omnipotence is that it's all power. It's not all powerful, because that would indicate a character, a being that is all powerful. But when we talk in unity about one power and one presence, God the good, omnipotence, we're referring to a principle, not a being, a principle of God. I talk about the idea that God is all consciousness, that it pervades the universe, that it is not it's not localized in a being, but rather it is consciousness itself. That idea as God as principle rather than God as being, that's principle with LE rather than AL. So if God as principle is the foundation for our understanding of truth, then it's not about, am I going to be smited, or smote, I guess. Am I going to be smote because of the words that I used, or the thoughts that I held, or my actions? Am I going to be eliminated from existence, or am I going to be sent to hell because of that? What else? What else? For Mark's benefit, as he's just coming on, I'll repeat the question. This idea of one power and one presence in the universe, how does that contribute to our spiritual freedom?
Well, for me as a child, one of the things that was a savior for my Christianity was that God was love. And love is good. And God loves all his children. and God makes no mistakes. There is a reason for everything. So I think that like saved me in my youth. He's not judging. Yes, he may be watching over me, but I always said, well, that's all the angels that you interact with. It's the people on earth were the angels. So it wasn't something from the sky in my thought process. And so I think for me, that gave me the freedom to say I am that I am. I'm okay exactly the way I am. And I'm not a cookie cutter of the other person. I was never a follower. But I wasn't a leader either. It was everybody deserves to be on earth. Everybody deserves to breathe. Everybody wants to be loved, wants to give love, receive love. And so that, I grew up Catholic. So that was a big difference from my parents, what they handed down to me. Mm-hmm. I was able to just say, it is what it is. It's all good. It's, and I explored many religions, and most of them from a Buddhist background of just be and let be. And I think that has given me freedom over the years to live a diverse life and say, everybody's good. We all have a God center. Oh, and I see Sophia. Yes.
Well, thank you, Rose. There's something I would like to point out. A phrase that you use is God may be watching, right? So there's that vestige of God as being a fundamental part of our conception. And that fundamental part of our conception of God as a being that watches is also an impediment to our spiritual journey. And I'll hopefully I'll get to that more, but I don't want to interrupt our conversation. I just wanted to point out that there are these subtle influences, the subtle shadows of that early teaching that comes up in our thoughts about our spiritual journey. Anyone else? Good morning, Mark.
I think that God is who we seek in solitude a lot of times. But I feel like the answers lie with the influence God and the feeling and the concept of understanding that God flows through everybody and that our answers can be found God working through other people, and that solitude where you gather your thoughts, feelings, and spiritual strength is translated through people who have the clues and the answers for you. If you interact and let the flow happen. And it's not just a single deity out there guiding you as if you were a puppet. It's letting you seek the resources of other people who have found enlightenment through God and other things, and who give you valuable clues about life and make it full because you are encompassing other people's feelings and thoughts that may be unique, but also build a stronger bond and foundation as you interact.
Those external influences that you're referring to, the friends, the interactions that you have, are like the tall posts on the snow-covered roadway. Those influencers are important for us as we navigate our spiritual journey, and it's important for us to claim our own authority and not to lay authority on those external influencers. Influencers are important. They do give us feedback. They give us information. They give us sometimes they give us a well trodden path that we can follow, but it may not be the path that is appropriate for us. So we have to be careful. We have to see those influences as opportunities for us to consider a different perspective, or maybe the same perspective that we hold, but nonetheless. Okay, thank you, John. Anyone else? What about freedom from intermediaries? You know that the empowering your wisdom is. I've used that for many years to try to release you from looking at me as an authority, perhaps someone who has some insight, perhaps someone who has some ideas for your consideration, but not as an authority. The authority rests with you, and that is an important thing for us to consider as we look at how we're going to navigate this journey. So, God the good, omnipotence, God the good, all power, God the good. What about evil? Where does evil come in here? Why do buildings collapse because of poor construction? Why are children starving across the planet? Because when there's sufficient food to feed everybody, and there is. Why do we have people embedded in a culture of war? Not just a passing uprising, but rather a lifelong. I mean, look at the people in Afghanistan. They have been involved in war since 1980, war against various enemies. Why is that? If there is not evil in the world, why do evil things occur? And if God is all power, then and all good, then why is evil allowed to exist?
That's a tough one. But what we always say is that God is in charge, and we don't know what God's plan is, and there will be a divine reason somehow for what happens.
Okay.
But it's hard to accept in our worldly view. But we have to know that God is in charge, and all will be well.
I will point out again the vestige of God as being. God in charge.
But yet it's comforting.
I know. It is comforting. It's comforting because it harkens back to an early perception of reality, right? I mean, that it may not be current habitual thought, but it was a thought stream that was present when all was well with the world. That food was on the table, that there was a roof over the head. Yeah, it's comforting. Any other thoughts? And I'm not trying to criticize anybody's ideas here. I'm just trying to point out the subtlety of those shadows of those early perceptions of God.
Well, I think evil happens because of consequences of our own actions. God gave us free will, and with that comes a responsibility. And when we don't act in accord with our principles, our unity principles, then evil happens as a consequence.
And why do we follow those dissonant paths? Why do Why do we take those dissonant actions or speak those dissonant words or have those dissonant thoughts that are
Well,
out
we're
of
listening
harmony
to our
with
ego. We're listening to our ego instead of God within.
And that goes back to what A Course in Miracles talks about with the ego, is that is that aspect of consciousness which demands that we are separate from each other and from God. And that separation that we impose upon ourselves, that separation consciousness is what keeps us out of the grace, to use another worn traditional term, but out of the grace of the all that is all, out of harmony of that underlying vibration that is God. That dissonance, that disharmony arises out of our perception that, oh man, I am separate and apart. I've got to grab for all I can get before someone else gets it. And once I get it, then I'm going to delve it out to those that I deem to be sufficiently worthy. So these ideas that we are separate and apart is really the foundation of evil. It is the foundation of erroneous thought. It is the foundation upon which shit happens. It is the ideas that that we have a obligation to grab for all we can get and hold on to what we get and delve it out in what we consider to be an appropriate way. That really is the basis of the dissonance of the world.
Mhm.
So if we can dissolve that, if we can let go of that, then our experience of evil, including, as Rose offered earlier in a prayer, our experience of evil will disappear. When we feel that there is someone that needs to be judged harshly, arises in our thought stream, there is that schism that is opening up between our perception of our oneness with God, and as soon as we see as someone as separate, then we are declaring ourselves separate from God. So there is one power and one presence in the universe. God the good, omnipotence, is a fundamental premise that we can build a fulfilling and a fulfilling journey of spiritual discovery. So when we have those dissonant thoughts, excuse me, when we have those dissonant thoughts, that can be that tall pole in the snow-covered mountain road that tells us, oops, we're straying off the path. When we have feelings of fear, we can see that as a tall pole. Oops, we're veering off the path. When we see ourselves as being superior to another, when we see ourselves hoarding abundance of various sorts, those are all flags for us. Not saying that we are evil, but that evil arises from those fundamental thoughts. So the one power and one presence, God the good, omnipotence, is a very useful tool for us to check out. If we veer from that, we will likely come into a place of disharmony. We will find ourselves out of alignment with that fundamental vibration that is God. We'll find ourselves in separation thinking. we'll find ourselves through that separation thinking going down a path that is not taking us into our final destination of the realization of God in our lives. So these 5 principles of unity that we're going to be covering over the course of the next 4 weeks. The premise we've talked about today. Next week we're going to talk about the proposition that the Christ resides in each of us, and that we're going to talk about the process of thoughts held in mind manifest in our experience, and we're going to talk about the practice of meditation and prayer and denials and affirmations. We're going to talk about the promise that when we uphold these principles, then our lives will be fulfilling and joyful. So, the fundamentals of unity, compiled in 1990. That still blows me away. 100 years after the formation of unity, but it was compiled by now her name escapes. Phyllis. No, that's not right. Anyway, the granddaughter of Charles Fillmore. She was asked for an article for Unity magazine, and the request of her was, you're the granddaughter of Charles Fillmore. Why don't you put together an article for the magazine that sums up Unity's teachings? And so she came up with these 5 principles of unity. I've renamed them the 5 pillars of faith because I really appreciate many of the teachings from Islam, but the idea that there is in these 5 statements really the foundation of the teachings of unity is powerful. It's easy to remember, and it is useful for us to guide us along our way. So I'd like to begin not with the meditation. I'd like to begin with music video from Karen Drucker. And Karen Drucker has, she's a balladeer. She has been around unity since dirt. She's not that old, but she has been around unity for as long as I can remember. And so here she is, Karen Drucker.
You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. You are the face of God. You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. You are the face of God. You are the face of God. Tu es l'image de Dieu. I hold you in my heart. Tu es l'image de l'amour. You are a part of me. You are the face of God. You are the face of God. Tu sei la luce di Dio. I hold you in my heart. Tu sei il volto dell'amore. You are a part of me. You are the face of God. You are the face of face of God, the face of God. I hold you in my heart, you in my heart. You are a part of me, a part of me. You are the face of God, the face of God. You are the face of God. Eres la luz de Dios. I hold you in my heart. Eres la cara del amor. You are a part of me. You are the face of God. 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 La luce di Dio. You are the face. You are the face of God. You are the face of God. L'image de Dieu. You are the face. You are the face of God. You are the face of God. La luz de Dios. You are the face. You are the face of God. You are the face of God. You are the face of God. You are the face of God.
Let's take some time here to settle into our meditation. As we acknowledge that when we look around, those people in our lives, acknowledging them as the face of God, as we individually are, so individually each of them also is. So I'd like you to bring to mind someone with whom you have conflict, someone that is distressing your life, someone that is causing disharmony. I'd like to hold them in mind and very sincerely express to them in mind, you are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. You are the face of God. Perhaps even in your own mind singing that song. You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. Feel the tension release. Feel the disharmony resolve. Feel that underlying vibration of God. And feel your harmonizing with it. And if that hasn't happened yet, go back to the image. Go back to the declaration. You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. And repeat that until that edge of tension, until that disharmony dissolves. And when you're ready, move to another who is offering you disharmony, who is creating stress. You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. Recognize that there is no need to change them. There's no need to see their behavior differently. Just acknowledge that they are part of you, in your heart, the face of God, the divine present in our lives. Perhaps to be a lesson, perhaps to be an example. But they are a divine appointment for your spiritual journey's progress. Whenever you find yourself in a situation that causes stress, the stress is likely pointing to another individual. Hold them. See them as the face of God. Bring them into your hearts and regard them as a part of you. And let that exercise be an experiment in your life, in the laboratory of your life. Let that experiment either substantiate or refute that basic premise. One power, one God. The good, omnipotence. And as we come back into this time and place, I remind you that this ministry is supported by your contributions, and your contributions are appreciated. Doug, if you will. Begin with me, let this be the moment. Take each moment and live each moment in peace eternally. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. Together, please. The light of God surrounds us. The love of God enfolds us. The power of God protects us, and the presence of God watches over us. Wherever we are, God is, and all is well. And so it is. Okay, if you would please.
As we prepare to release our circle and extinguish this flame, we honor the Christ light it represents, and we carry that light within us into the world to protect us, to illuminate us, and to guide our actions.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and it's a wonderful week. It's a wonderful day. Happy 4th of July. And we